I think a book that really encapsulates the stories that matter most for me are probably the first book that I read as a teenager that had a lifelong impression on me. And that's a book called A Kestrel for a Knave by a British author, Barry Hines. And that book mattered so much to me at the time, not only because I enjoyed reading it, because what I learned and understood through that book is that the protagonist in that novel, a boy named Billy Casper, who lives on the other side of the world. So this is a novel set in the north of England in a coal mining town in the 1960s, that I could read this book half a planet away in Melbourne and still feel that the story of this boy was a story that not only I recognised, it was a story that I also shared in to some extent. So what it taught me is about the universal appeal of really quality storytelling, and the book has stayed with me my whole life. The book I'd always take with me would be a book called Island, The Collected Stories by the Canadian writer Alistair MacLeod. It's a book that I've read many, many times, and I think that it's a book that I would take with me because I would both enjoy the familiarity of going back to stories that I know. So it's a book of short stories, but also MacLeod is such a wondrous writer that each time I read the book, I do read it afresh. There are elements of the storytelling and the language that I discover for the first time. So I would both be familiar with the work and be really surprised by the work. Alistair MacLeod is quite a literary writer in many senses, but a writer who wrote with great emotion and compassion about place and people. And I think it's a book that I know I read as what I would call a comfort read. It's a book I love to read during winter. I love to read it when it's cold outside and I'm sort of bedded down or snugly inside the house. And it gives me that great sense of what it is that I love about writing, what it is I love about books. So I would take that because it would not only give me a great sense of refamiliarizing myself with a writer I love, but I think it would give me really emotional security if I was alone on a spaceship or even in company of people I didn't like on a spaceship. The first library I ever visited was the Fitzroy Public Library, which used to be in the town hall. It's now called the Reading Room. It's not the library any longer. It's interesting to note that it's also the room that I was fortunate enough to launch two of my books in. My first book, Shadowboxing, I launched at the Reading Room, and my novel Ghost River I launched there, and that was very emotional for me. But my first visit to the library was very daunting. The Fitzroy Library was a place of silence. You wanted to wear slippers when you went into the library so you wouldn't make any noise. And the librarian was known to be a very stern man. So you went in there with a sense of trepidation. And I remember feeling a terrible emotion when I first went into the library. It was one of fear that I shouldn't be here or what could I do here. But that changed so quickly when I found a book on the shelf that I really enjoyed. And I sat down and I remember reading a few pages of a book. And then the librarian said, "Do you like that book?" And I said, "Yes." And he asked me, he said, "Are you going to borrow the book?" And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know that you could actually borrow books from a library. And I still remember that day leaving the Fitzroy Library with a book in my hand and a library card. And I was astonished that someone would actually allow me to take this precious object out of the care of the library and take it home. It seemed to me to be such an act of generosity that I didn't really comprehend it. And that first engagement with the public library, again, is something that I've treasured. It's something that has stayed with me my whole life. I'm a member of the Yarra Libraries now. I've always had a library card, and I'm a great advocate of the public library because I still do some of my own writing at the Fitzroy Library occasionally. And one of the things that you note when you go into a public library is that you will meet and see people in the libraries who wouldn't have access to computers, to newspapers, to literature if they didn't have the support of a public library, because some people can't afford to buy books. It's still a luxury that some people can't afford. So I think my introduction epitomizes the value that I have for libraries in that they serve such an important public interest. And in fact, I think they are the most important public institution we have beyond say, with the exception, sorry, of probably our health system. I think they look after our emotional and mental health so importantly. I've got a story in my new collection called The Librarian, by the way. I think it's called The Librarian. It's about a librarian at my high school who was an anarchist, and she was a crazy sort of cigarette smoking gothic anarchist, and she was actually quite wonderful. The book that I first recognized, I suppose, as connecting with my life are the two books by Mark Twain, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and the Huckleberry Finn book. And I think I loved those books when I read them because of the waywardness of those key characters, particularly the Huck Finn character, and his detachment from authority and his antagonism towards authority, and the sense of freedom that he wanted to express through his love of the river, the Mississippi River, is something that I did understand and did relate to very strongly. I've written a lot about the Birrarung, the Yarra River, and I was very lucky as a kid, say from the age of about 10 and right from my teenage years, to live very close to the river and always have a mischievous association with the river. So all the transgressions that I note in my life as a teenager all happened down at the river or in the river, which I used to swim in a lot as a teenager. So I had great affection for those characters, and I felt that the escaping into that book, they are not books like a book like A Kestrel for a Knave, which is set, of course, in social realism. The books, the Twain books, were very escapist, but because of that, they allowed me to escape from reality into a fantasy of great freedom and transgression. So I really felt a very strong association with those books and great affection for those books as a kid. Oh, I think this is no doubt that a writer that I've discovered in more recent years, Lucia Berlin. She has a remarkable collection called A Manual for Cleaning Women. And she is a writer who was rediscovered in a sense. I think she died in the early 2000s, and she published her short stories in small press publications. The Manual for Cleaning Women was a book that came out and released most of her stories in one collection. And I'd heard the buzz around the book, and you do hear a buzz around a book, and often you can be let down. But when I read her story from the first sentence of the first story and right through the book, these are stories, the protagonists are by and large women, and certainly the first person narratives through a voice of a woman. And she has these incredible female characters who are, again, transgressive, who are feisty, who are troublemakers, or they make mistakes there, and they're very funny. So that what I love about her writing is that she deals with really important social issues, really important issues of relationships between men and women, and women getting a really raw deal in society. But there's such a sassiness and strength in the women in her books that I love reading her stories. And it's another book that I'm happy to go back to again and again. And one of the reasons I go back to reading Lucia Berlin, and one of the reasons I enjoyed her book so much, is that her craft of being able to produce a pitch perfect voice is a great lesson in writing. So for me as a writer, when I'm thinking about hearing a voice of a character or getting that voice as strong or as perfect as I can, I will read Lucia Berlin, and not in the sense to mimic her work, but to think this is a writer who really knows what she's doing. And I was so blessed to discover Lucia Berlin, and I've certainly passed her on to a lot of people, particularly younger women who are writing, that I may have taught when I used to teach writing, or that if I've spoken to younger writers about craft, I always suggest that they read Lucia Berlin, because I think she's a great mentor and role model, particularly for young women wanting to write and wanting to really step out and take a chance. She took a lot of chances in her writing, and I think it's all the better for it. I am drawn to characters who do sit outside the mainstream. Yeah, that's me. I'm the naughty underdog.